Ladies and gentlemen, so hello to everyone, those of you here in the room and also those of you online. It's great to welcome you to this wonderful evening. Well, it's not really evening yet, is it? Still afternoon, not evening. But to the 2019 RHS John MacLeod Lecture. And I'd also like to welcome and thank Dr Andrew Hirons, who'll be sharing some of his knowledge, or all of your knowledge here at today's lecture. Andrew is a senior lecturer in Arboriculture, which I could kill Alistair because I find Arboriculture a really difficult word to say. So if I stumble during the many mentions of it in a moment, you'll understand why. But a senior lecturer in Arboriculture at Myerscough College here in the UK. He began his career in arboriculture as a climbing arborist, which I have to say I think possibly merits David Attenborough calling you a climbing arborist. I'm not quite sure. And plant healthcare technician, gaining experience in Australia, America and the UK before joining the arboriculture department at Myerscough in 2004. He's a course tutor for the online foundation degree in arboriculture and tree management, where he teaches modules relating to tree biology, tree establishment and tree management. His current research activity is motivated by the need to create resilience in our urban forests and is focused on using plant traits to inform tree selection for urban environments. This work has resulted in a number of publications, including Species Selection for Green Infrastructure, a guide for specifiers, published by Trees and Design Action Group. Andrew's also the co-author of the book Applied Tree Biology. His other activities include sitting on the Education and Training Committee of the Arboricultural Association. The RHS, meanwhile, led by our fabulous science team, is fully aware of the ever-increasing challenges of climate change, as highlighted in our recent RHS Gardening in a Changing Climate report. As the UK works towards ambitious tree planting targets, it will be critical to have evidence-based knowledge on which trees to plant. Today's lecture is entitled Tree Traits for Cityscapes, and Dr Hirons will be talking about the environmental and health benefits of trees, inspired by all of his research into creating future resilience in our urban forests. Now, in line with the content of this lecture and the current concerns over our changing climate, I'm really very pleased and have the greatest pleasure to announce that the RHS, in collaboration with Frank P. Matthews Nursery, will be jointly funding a new 5-year fellowship that will aim to identify trees that will perform well in the future where more extreme weather events are anticipated. We'll soon be recruiting a tree scientist to conduct research and then advise gardeners on the trees best suited to withstand and help minimise the impact of climate change, something that we're all concerned about. We're so pleased that Dr Hirons has agreed to collaborate with us on making this fellowship a success, and I know that we all look forward to Andrew sharing his current knowledge with us on the environmental and health benefits of trees. So the floor is yours, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Sue, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming, and hello to those of you that are watching from further afield. So I'd like to really talk about tree traits for cityscapes, and I think it's a good place to start. We tend to say that trees give us a whole range of benefits. They might be termed ecosystem services, and they come in all sorts of guises: economic benefits, benefits to our mental well-being, mitigating flood risk, and of course a whole range of other things. And I think it's really important that we recognise the contribution, the overwhelmingly positive contribution that trees can make to our lives. They certainly do enrich it. I was engaging in what I like to call productive procrastination last week, and I picked an old book off my shelf. I should have been probably doing something else, but anyway, sometimes you get distracted like that. And it's one of the earliest books on shade trees in towns and cities. It's published well over 100 years ago now, and it was a North American publication. And in it says that, well, Washington, D.C. had done a variety of experiments, and only about 10 to 12 of species were suitable for streets. Something else it talked about was a survey done in Paris where it said only 11 species were represented by more than 100 specimens, and only 9 species were represented by more than 1,000 specimens. And actually, there were 17,000 horse chestnuts and 26,000 oriental planes. So just 2 species made up 50% of the urban tree population in Paris. And William Soloratov, he said, all points considered, the oriental plane makes such an admirable street tree that it is a temptation to plant it to the exclusion of other trees. And I think actually that's really quite an important observation in some ways. And I would say we still succumb to that temptation to plant what has worked historically, and we tend to be reflective rather than make decisions that have got good foresight. And this historical legacy has, international implications, if you like. In New York, about 20% of New York State's trees are Norway maple on the streets. In Helsinki, 44% of the street trees are limes. In Beijing, in China, 25% of the trees represented in the urban forest are pagoda trees. And even in what is internationally pretty diverse, London has about 50% of its urban tree canopy made up with just 10 species. And so it's important that we recognise that the fundamental lack of diversity, particularly within our street tree populations, is potentially a real risk factor going forward. And I just want to flag up one study that was done in Scandinavia by some colleagues over there, Henrik Hvalman and Johan Osberg, and they just looked at the vulnerability of Nordic trees, in terms of their urban trees, to 2 species of longhorn beetle, Asian longhorn beetle and citrus longhorn beetle. And I think what they found is really quite sobering. They found that in most cities, under the worst case scenarios, those 2 insect pests could remove over 90% of their street tree population. So, even under, if you like, much more likely scenarios, we're still talking about 30 to 50% worth of street tree losses, just with those 2 insect pests alone. And if you were here this time last year for Nicholas Spence's MacLeod Lecture, you will have realised the biosecurity threats that are present in our more regional area, coming across from Europe or Asia, United States, and so on. And so we do have these strategic challenges for the urban forest. And if you like, this schematic just shows, well, we got the urban forest, most of which hopefully is performing rather well, but some of which, through challenging environmental conditions, will be poorly performing. And actually, when you add climate change and the threats associated around increased drought, increased heat, precipitation, regime change, and so on, coupled with that accelerated migration of pests and pathogens, much of that urban forest is going to be pushed through that, if you like, poor performance threshold and into that tree mortality zone. And therefore, we really must take good care of the trees that we have, as well as good care over the selection of our future trees that we hope will serve generations to come. So I suppose a question for me is, and can species selection contribute to these strategic challenges? Well, I would say, of course, yes. And perhaps a good place to start is, well, how do we currently select trees for our green infrastructure? Because the way that is informed can be quite important. And I was lucky enough to lead a NERC grant on it's a green infrastructure innovation project. And at the start of that project, we looked and we surveyed practitioners and professionals and asked, well, where do you source your current guidance from in terms of tree selection? And across a whole range of professional groups, landscape architects, arboriculture consultants, local authority officers, the overwhelming feedback was that the tree nursery catalogues dominated selection decisions. So, of course, there are a variety of other ways to select trees, dendrological literature, online tools, recommendations from Nursery. But it's those nursery catalogues which people were really relying on for their selection decisions. And yet, we were getting other feedback from that same survey saying many of the nursery catalogues offer conflicting advice. Never depend on nursery catalogues alone, and hard technical information is very difficult to come by, with nursery information often being very superficial and based on aesthetic features. So there seemed to be this sort of awareness that nursery catalogues were perhaps not the best thing to be relying on, yet that's what everybody did anyway. 37% of people identified experience as being important, and I would certainly never want to diminish the value of experience, but it's necessarily backward looking, isn't it? It applies hindsight to what's worked historically and doesn't really deliver in terms of foresight necessarily. Only about 4% of people actually went to nurseries or visited botanic collections to inform their selection decisions. So, this is part of the strategic challenge we have as a community, because we need to somehow decouple the commercial advice from the advice that is able to deliver sensible strategic decisions for our landscape in the future. And so one of the major outputs of that project was this Teabag guide, Trees and Design Action Group guide, Trees Species Selection for Green Infrastructure. And it's a digital guide, but if you print it out, here it is. It's easier to show people the sort of magnitude of it. If I hold it up that way, perhaps you'll see. It's one of those things that it's sort of, if you're going to use the office printer, it's easier to seek forgiveness than permission, I think. You can print it out. It's freely available to download from the Teabag website. So, I hope that it's a really useful resource, and I know I've even been speaking to people today that have found it useful. So there are about 280 plus species profiles in there, and Henrik, Hualman and myself as the authors, spend a lot of time over the details of some of these profiles. But I will say that taxonomic assurance is really essential. And variation in nomenclature makes precise specification really quite difficult sometimes. And there is quite a lot of variation as the naming of plants sort of evolves over time, and the botanists then throw a bit of a spanner into the work and so on. So it's really important that that the nomenclature is right, and that we are operating as a community on the same plane, if you like. And one of the things I think is interesting is, well, what is it about the difference in species and cultivars that really leads to a difference in tree performance? Because I think if we can unpack that, we stand a much better chance of getting really good quality landscapes. And we've looked at 6 use potentials, because it's very difficult to have every single possible planting scenario represented. But park, for example, is unconstrained rooting environments, unconstrained above ground environments. Paved trees, or those that are suitable for paved environments, have got at least a moderate drought tolerance imposed upon them. And suds have a moderate drought tolerance and a moderate waterlogging tolerance, and so on. So we've got particular criteria around those particular use potentials. And I just really want to focus today on some work I've been doing to try and improve tree selection around the paved environment, as well as some more recent work trying to improve selection around sud schemes. If we look at trees in typical urban or paved environments, then they're thrust into rather narrow margins, small planting beds, and it's little wonder that they struggle to survive and certainly perform in many situations. And one of the major challenges is to the acquisition of water, and that's certainly a key attribute that trees suitable for paved environments need. So as well as climatic drought, lack of precipitation for extended periods of time, and that is likely to occur more regularly. Things like compaction. So this particular tree is in Nuremberg, but I'm sure within 2 minutes walk from here, I could also find plenty of compaction around urban trees. And you know, if the rooting environment is so compacted that the fine roots don't proliferate and develop within that soil volume, it doesn't really matter that that particular tree has got what seems to be quite a large area, because so much of that soil volume is unavailable to the fine root material that's so essential for resource acquisition of nutrients and water. So that's, you know, certainly one challenge. We have impermeable surfaces in the urban environment, and these trees are about 40 years old, believe it or not. It's remarkable they've survived at all, especially when you look at where they're planted. So this is in southern Sweden. It doesn't really matter how much it rains there, because you've totally decoupled the precipitation from what the tree is experiencing. So again, impermeable surfaces require that trees need to be more drought tolerant. We have restricted soil volumes. There's lots of technology and approaches now to expand soil volumes in urban areas, but frankly, they don't always get used. And this is a great shot from Johan that shows these maple trees around the margins that have shared rooting environments that are just performing much, much more effectively than those that are in the isolated central car park spots, probably with a cubic metre of soil if they're lucky. Of course, in all likelihood, those trees were planted at exactly the same time. But they're delivering very different levels of performance based on the quality of the rooting environment. Got some trees don't worry about rooting environment. These figs from Hong Kong, you know, certainly soil volume is not their particular problem, but they do certainly present the other management risks, as you can imagine. And there's always a tree that's going to be the exception rather than the rule. So the question then is, isn't it, how do trees cope with limited water availability? And I suppose like any stress, you know, there are those that avoid the stress and those that tolerate the stress. I'm a bit of a stress avoider. Okay, when my marking lands, I pretend for several days, if not a week or so, that it just doesn't exist. And then all of a sudden it's sort of sink or swim, you know, and I've got to really scramble to get it all done. Other people just, you know, first night it's submitted, they're taking it away and just chipping away and getting it done. I'm not like that. Anyway, trees are somewhat similar in the sense that they can either avoid the water deficit or they can tolerate the water deficit. And one way to avoid the deficit is to maximize water acquisition, or you can reduce the water use. Okay? And I've sort of got a scheme where there's physiological, structural, life cycle approaches. I'll pick out a few of those. So you can maximize water acquisition by deep rooting. So there's many Mediterranean trees, for example, that can go 20, 30, 40, 50 meters down. And if they can get that deep and into groundwater sources, it doesn't really matter how much it rains because they've avoided that water deficit building up in the first place. And of course, we're probably familiar with things like stomatal closure to reduce water use, but even life cycle approaches like leaf phenology. So you get summer deciduous trees in warm climates, which just say, okay, well, I'm just going to abandon transpiration and photosynthesis during summer. It's just too tough. I'll happily photosynthesize during winter. So their period of greatest environmental limitation is the summer, not winter. Of course, our trees avoid the cold, which is why they lose their leaves at this time of year. But then you've got this inherent tolerance to water deficit as well. And some of those mechanisms are around osmotic adjustment, a low tergalos point, and resistance to drought-induced cavitation. And actually, they're the ones that I think are much more sensible to focus on, particularly if we're talking about trees in the urban realm, because frankly, if we've got an oak or some other species that's used to deeply rooting, and you stick it over a car park or in a street scenario which can only, got a rooting depth of 1 metre or 1.5 metres, then you've removed its natural ability to deal with that particular stress. So it's these fundamental tolerance characteristics that I think are most important. And I would say avoid the avoiders for challenging sites. On the left there is a row or an avenue of lime trees. That was the first week in July 2018. Okay, we had a pretty warm summer. We actually had a summer that year, right? But you can't really say that those trees are performing. They've lost most of their leaves. The one on the right, the betula there, well, I mean, okay, it's in a container, but this is in August. You can see the trees in the background have got plenty of leaves on them, and yet that tree has just avoided that deficit by shedding its leaves. Brilliant. If you've lost all your leaves, all of a sudden don't need so much water. This is not what we call performance in the landscape. This is not the way we select trees to deliver all those ecosystem services that we rely on. So I suppose the message is that drought-tolerant trees have this inherent resilience. They can cope with the lower levels of water. They're able to extract water from the soil for a longer period during the drying cycle. They maintain physiological activity for much longer, and that equals carbon gain. It equals transpiration, evaporative cooling, all those things that we actually want trees to be doing. And so they will perform much better as landscape trees on challenging sites. So it's actually trying to understand those mechanisms and understand the linkages between those traits and performance that's quite important. So then if we accept that, how do we go about selecting for drought tolerance? Well, we can go to the literature, and I take great pleasure in having too many tree books, probably. There's never too many tree books, right? Never too many. But if you engage with this sort of dendrological and plant use literature, you find this sort of thing. So this is it just for Acer negundo. Useful for sandy, dry to sterile soil, drought tolerant. Native habitat is along streams and ponds. Okay. Native in moist habitats, but performs well also in poor wet or dry habitats. Well, that's really helpful, isn't it? Really nailing exactly where that plant can go. Very heat and drought tolerant, grows along shores of permanent bodies of water, likes humid areas, grows along stream banks, floodplains and swamps. Well, if you're not into your trees and you're just trying to engage with the literature, how do you make sense of that? This is a single species, and there are multiple examples of this sort of thing in the literature, which is probably why, the nursery catalogues vary a little bit and everything varies a little bit. You can turn to some great ecological literature, and this is an excellent study that was done, a meta-analysis of lots and lots of different species. In fact, there's a great supplementary data set to this with the shade, drought and waterlogging tolerance of about 800 different species. And this is, like an ecological meta-analysis. Basically, the drought tolerance index was a scale of 1 to 5. And 1 was, I won't bore you with the details, but pretty wet and not very long dry periods and so on. And 5 at the other end of the extreme, much more variation in the way rainfall falls, much more extended dry periods. And so for our Teabag guide, Henrik and I basically took, we've got 1 to 2 we're going to call sensitive, 2 to 3 moderately sensitive, 3 to 4 moderately tolerant, 4 to 5 tolerant. So there was some ecological data behind some of the qualitative terms we were applying to the drought tolerance. So that was useful, but as I've already said, it doesn't, survival ecologically doesn't necessarily equal performance in the landscape. And certainly those limes and birch would show that. So how do we go about improving selection decisions? Well, I believe that a trait-based assessment, so something quantifiable characteristic that reveals something of the tree's personality, if you like, can be really helpful here, because it puts a number, if you like, on the extent of drought tolerance. And 2 particular traits that I'm interested in are the leaf turgor loss point, what you might have come across as a permanent wilting point, and the stem water potential at 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity. So this leaf turgor loss point is basically a universal measure of physiological drought tolerance, and it's quantifiable, it's measurable, it's sort of proven in the literature. and is actually now relatively easily measured. And we use a technique where we measure something called the osmotic potential at full turgor, and then from that there's a linear relationship with this turgor loss point. And the first sort of major bit of work that we did on this, well, I say we, I mean Henrik did most of the work at his postdoc work at Cornell University. And we decided to look at ASA as a group because we knew that they should vary quite a lot in their tolerance to drought. And so in the botanical gardens in Cornell University, there were a whole range of maples in sufficient replication that we could actually do some science on them. And so what we did was we measured the turgor loss point. So this is all in the same garden or botanical collection. And we measured the turgor loss point, and we found actually that, surprise, surprise, it varied quite a lot. And so the more negative the turgor loss, the more drought tolerant it is. So I've ranked those according to their summer turgor loss, and so the ones appearing towards the bottom of that chart are more drought tolerant. And so what we found was, although we measured them in the same garden, actually it kind of all actually made sense. We found that Acer spicatum, this is its natural habitat, a shady understory maple species, used to humid, rather dark environments. It had a turgor loss point of minus 1.6 megapascals. So that's relatively high, relatively sensitive to drought. Another understory maple, Acer truncatum, that's found in this sort of environment at Qingling Mountains in China, cool, humid, shady environment, had a rather high turgor loss point of minus 2.4 megapascals. Yet if you go to some maples from the drier environments, Acer tataricum there from the steppe forest, we have minus 3.6 megapascals. And Acer grandidentatum from the Rocky Mountains there, minus 3.8 megapascals. In fact, Acer montpecillanum was even more negative than that, at minus 4 megapascals. So we were able to find, even by screening trees in the same botanic collection, we were able to segregate them according to their drought tolerance using this turgor loss. And we also found that Acer cultivars differed significantly in their turgor loss. So Acer saccharum, Green Mountain, was significantly more drought tolerant than Green Column or Cardo. And Acer rubrum Northwood was more drought tolerant than Red Sunset. Now, is this because they come from different ecotypes, different provenances that were perhaps more exposed to drought in their evolutionary history? Frankly, we don't know, because most of the knowledge about where those cultivars have ever come from is lost in the horticultural ether. We haven't got a clue where they're from. But it would be really valuable to find out whether this sort of ecotypic variation can be translated into cultivars. And so if we have this sort of urban planting bed type scenario where you've got highly constrained rooting environments, and we take a scheme like that and we say, well, okay, let's plant those sensitive species in there. Well, of course they're going to fail. They haven't got the fundamental traits that deliver good performance. Whereas if you take them from further down that slide, if you like, and then place them in those challenging conditions, they're much more likely to perform well. And so the conclusions of that particular study was that, well, there was wide variation in physiological drought tolerance, even across closely related species and cultivars. It certainly may be useful as a screening tool, but also, I think really critically, we can say to nurseries, look, we've screened these species. We really reckon these are going to be great for particular environments because we have that trait confidence in them. And it takes away some of the risk, because otherwise nurseries have to dedicate hectares and hours of man time and production to trees that we might never buy. They take all the risk only our fashion to change. So absolutely, we can use this to help support our nurseries make decisions going forward. And the situation so far, we've screened about 200 species like this now. And, you know, in terms of our recommendations, we were then able to say, well, okay, our sensitive species had a turgor loss point higher than 2.5 megapascals. Our moderately sensitive were between 2.5 and 3. Our moderately tolerant were between 3 and 3.5, and our tolerant was more negative than 3.5 megapascals. So although we're making easily to understand qualitative statements about trees, it's underpinned by actual data that we can relate to. And there's been a whole range of academic partners there, funders. Formas is a big Swedish funder, NERC, you'll be familiar with, Tree Fund, Fund for Trees, the Arboricultural Association. They've all chipped money into supporting this work, and lots of collections from Cornell to the collection at Alnarp in Sweden, the Morton Arboretum has just been involved, Nest Botanic Gardens, Hillier Nurseries, Kew Gardens as well. They have all contributed their plant material to us doing this sort of analysis. So, for a lot of species we have that sort of level of information. For some species we have this vulnerability to embolism, and this is perhaps getting a little bit technical, but these are curves that describe how quickly the hydraulic system will shut down as the tree dries out, if you like. So at this end of the scale, we've got full conductivity within the xylem. We've got water transported, no problem, from the roots to the crown. Yet as we have a water deficit build up in the plant, actually the xylem vessels become dysfunctional as air is sucked into the vessels. And that results in a loss of conductivity. And at the other end of the scale, we have a total loss of conductivity in the xylem, whereby basically water is unable to get from the roots to the leaves. And if we take what they call the P50 value, so the value of 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity, that's again, it's a trait that you can measure, quantify. And in this case, this Acidophyllum japonicum has got a P50 of around minus 2.1 megapascals, so that gave us confidence to give it a sensitive rating. Whereas something like Eucommia armoides has got something like a minus 3.7 megapascal P50, and that gave us confidence to recommend it as a drought tolerant tree. So you can see that by understanding these traits and collecting this data that it's perfectly achievable. We can really create rigor and robustness within our recommendations. Of course, the consequences of high percentage loss of conductivity is a dieback in the crown. As those hydraulic pathways contract and they're just simply not able to supply the crown with water. And so often you see that in urban plantings. So there are physiological explanations for these sorts of observations. Okay, well, that was a little bit about the traits that can underpin the paved environment recommendations. More recently, in the last year or so, I've been beginning to think about, well, what about the other end of the spectrum? What about waterlogging, particularly because suds is becoming much, much more important as part of our urban design. And, they're quite challenging because they've actually got to be moderately tolerant or tolerant to drought. Why? Because actually they're so free draining, those substrates. They can be really extremely sandy substrates because they're designed to shift water through them, that actually when it's not raining and they're not flooded, they're really dry. So they've got to be really dry, but they've also obviously got to have some tolerance to waterlogging. And one of the outcomes, if you like, of surveying all these trees for the Teabag guide, it's not great information on waterlogging tolerance in trees at all. In fact, there's very little beyond ecological observations of what grows near watercourses. And so the challenge was, well, how do we begin to give some sort of quantitative measure of waterlogging tolerance? And so I turned to sap flow. Why? Because it gives continuous data. It's sensitive to both the atmospheric as well as the edaphic conditions. It integrates the root system as well as the crown. And, by understanding sap flow dynamics, you can work out the volume of water transpired by a tree. How much water is going back up through that tree and back into the atmosphere. And you can see here I've got VPD. Well, that integrates, if you like, relative humidity and temperature. So it's the atmospheric demand. And we can see here there's a cool period of cool weather, high relative humidity and rain, the sap flow drops, and we've got a warm, low relative humidity, and the sap flow picks up again. So we've got sap flow that matches the VPD very closely. And it's great, dynamic, interesting data. And we can hopefully use this to understand our tolerance to waterlogging. So I took Prunus macchiae, which I assume to be sensitive to waterlogging, and you can see, well, pre-treatment they were pretty similar. I then stuck them in some water. It's a lot easier to do waterlogging stuff in Lancashire than Drought, believe me. And within a matter of days, you see that divergence of sap flow from the control versus the waterlogged trees. So again, you get the similar patterns following the vapor pressure deficit and so on. But it was reduced to about 50% after a week, and then I drained that pot. And actually, at peak stress, there were no visual differences between those trees whatsoever. Yet, after I drained them, the waterlogged trees maintained about 50% level of sap flow compared with the control trees. And for those of you that are more interested in gas exchange, if you do the gas exchange, you find that, again, within 48 hours, we had highly significant reductions in photosynthesis and stomatal conductance. And that actually was, obviously, through the waterlogging period, was depleted somewhat and then was maintained at about, between 50 and 60% of that after that week where we drained them. So this was quite exciting because I thought, well, the sap flow is really quite responsive here. Let's do another one, Acer-platanoides. Again, it's a little bit sensitive, so don't make fun of it. So we have the waterlogging being imposed at this point, and you can see again a really rapid response, a decline in the sap flow as that fine root material dies off because of the anaerobic conditions. It's much harder for the water to get into the system. And then even after we drained it, it continued to decline. Again, after a week, no visual symptoms whatsoever, but it just kept going down and down. And they ultimately lost their crowns. And this is after a week's waterlogging. And there was nothing left bar the samaras on the tree. So a slightly different response, but it was interesting to note that platanoides was really very sensitive. And again, with the photosynthesis and the stomatal conductance, that supports that rapid decline, loss of conductivity, loss of photosynthesis very early within that stress cycle. And of course, once the leaves are gone, that's it, probably till next year. So what about something that should be tolerant? Salix alba should be tolerant to waterlogging. And so we plunge it in water. And there's no divergence. They just love it. It's a bit spiky because it was an awful week. It rained loads. So we kind of had showers and then dry, wet and dry. So the sap flow is a bit noisy. But they just didn't seem to take any notice whatsoever. And so it was great because we had these continuous data sets that give us some insight as to how the tree is responding under that waterlogging scenario. That is a bit of a gap in the data there because it went dark for a few days and they're solar powered. The pitfalls of Lancashire fieldwork, I'm afraid. And if we look at the data, yes, we did get a reduction at peak stress, not after a few days, but certainly after a full week of waterlogging, we got a reduction in photosynthesis and stomatal conductance. But after a week of drainage, it went right back up to control levels. So they were able to recover much more effectively. And, well, part of the reason behind that is things like this, what they call hypertrophied lenticels. They're enlarged lenticels that appear around the base of a tree to help redress that oxygen deficit and so on that's within the root system. So we've got, these physiological traits that we can observe as well. And so, if I was to conclude, we're halfway through this study, I would say, well, sap flow is a great tool to evaluate waterlogging tolerance. There seem to be at least 3 responses to sap flow. Firstly, a decline throughout the waterlogging period that then sort of stabilises, if you like, upon draining. And to be honest, I don't know how long it's going to take before that then reaches back up to control levels. A decline throughout the waterlogging period that then continues to decline after draining, and that's probably related to something called post-anoxic stress, whereby the reoxygenation of the root system upon draining releases all sorts of toxins that can then be detrimental or further detriment to the fine roots, or pretty much no response, as in the salix. So we hope to do a lot more species over the next year or so, and so we really begin to understand a range of species responses. Photosynthesis and stomatoconductance are certainly very sensitive to waterlogging, but I have to say, visual analysis is pretty useless, in identifying physiological stress, and probably some other physiologists will nod along with that. That really is, at least for some stresses, pretty much too late by the time you're observing those prominent visual symptoms. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I just want to sort of wrap up now and say, well, what does the future of tree selection look like? I think, there has to be less hindsight and more foresight, particularly when we're presented with the challenges of climate change and the biosecurity challenges. I think we need to be much better as a community at integrating evidence-based approaches, so that although we might translate information into easily accessible language, that some of those qualitative terms are really underpinned by quantitative data. And I think I've given some examples of how we can do that. I think there needs to be much more focus on landscape performance, not just landscape aesthetic. And I would never want to diminish aesthetic. Of course, we all enjoy beautiful landscapes, but we have to think more broadly than that. We have to think, well, how can we use landscapes to, cool people in heated urban areas? How do we use landscapes to mitigate those flood risks? How do we use them to improve the mental well-being or uplift the economic value of a particular area? And that means that we need to support and enable scientists. And I'm thrilled to be involved with this new project the RHS has announced today, because it's exactly, I think, the sort of collaborative efforts that need to be in place. And we need to make sure that scientists are enabled and fostered and supported in that. And we need to be generous with our knowledge. We need to translate that knowledge so it doesn't stay in the academic journals, but a really primary focus is that, this knowledge is translated to those people that need to use it, those people that are selecting trees for their gardens, their streets, their parks. And, and again, an example of that is the work that I did with the Trees and Design Action Group. So I hope that that's given you a useful insight into some of the approaches that we can take and use as a model for much, much more ambitious projects. And, I hope that you found that interesting and stimulating. Thanks for your attention. It's really great to see some nodding heads and things as I've gone through. And, I just leave you with a gratuitous shot of a baobab, because why not? My email's there if you want to get in touch and follow up any of the work that I've been doing. But thanks for your attention.
Great. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alistair Griffiths. I'm the Director of Science and Collections for the RHS, and I can't say how great it was. We had a conversation. I think I was on the train the other week going, oh, I'm so excited about this. It's such a really exciting time in relation to the way that we look at not just species, but cultivars, and the way that cultivars, and also that all of this is underpinned by horticultural and taxonomy. Because without that knowledge bank of the taxonomy and the taxonomy that people do, it's critical to do that. The other exciting thing is Nick Dunn in here. Sorry to embarrass you, but it has been challenging to get industry to want to support and fund the project. And Nick has been one of these people who's got a nursery called the Tree of Life, which I think is Frank P. Matthews, and he got it. In fact, if you see his book, it's not a pitch, but if you see his book, he's already got the little labels on there, but it's not underpinned by the evidence that this new fellowship can give. So I'm really excited, and we need to work with others to make sure we make this realised, because the more trees we have, and there's a big challenge of planting trees, but the right trees in the right places with the right knowledge is critical. So I think what is good to know is that fellowship is happening, and anyone out there, it's now online, it's advertised, it's a really exciting opportunity, pardon the pitch, but if you're out there and you want to make a significant difference, then apply for this fellowship. Because I believe with this and others, that, and with Andy's support, and with Mark Gush, who is also a water scientist, and Tiana and my team, I think we can work together with industry to really create new climate resilient trees for the future, as other people are working on it as well. So anyway, I'll stop rambling on. The other thing is that I went to Myerscough College. And I'm Lancastrian, so it's really great. I'm going to be able to go back up there and start to have conversations back. And Myerscough has always been an excellent college and has always been forward thinking. So it's great that Andy's there. Right, questions, sorry. Questions for Andy. Now, we haven't got a roaming microphone, so can you stand up and ask your question? And then, Andy, you'll repeat the question and try and shout. Yeah.
Andy, you particularly choose trees for urban situations are often landscape designers and architects. You mentioned trees in the design action group. How does that work with your research?
Well, in the case of that, so the question is, how does the Trees in Design Action Group work with my research?
And garden design.
And garden design, yeah. So the Trees in Design Action Group are really a relatively small core of people that try and bring together guidance for a very wide range of practitioners. So people from the built environment, landscape architecture, tree professionals, and most of their projects are done on they've got a project funded, and that's delivered. For example, the document Trees in Hard Landscapes. In my case, it was a NERC innovation project, so a green infrastructure innovation project. And Teabag were a really useful umbrella organisation to help me disseminate the fundamental science. And so we had them as a partner on the project because they had that proven track record for guidance, and my guidance could fit within their family of guidance. And so I worked very closely with their graphic designer that they use, and we came up with the guidance. So really they were a tool as a partner for disseminating knowledge to the people that need it,
Just stand up so we can hear. That was a great lecture, and I think the graphics were absolutely terrific. It really, really sold it. I wanted to ask, many species occur over a large range. We get different provenances. What evidence is there for variation within species?
So the question is, what evidence is there for variation within species, particularly those that have a very large geographical range? I think there is pretty good evidence. So we've, for example, done some work on Betula pendula. So Nest Botanic Gardens up in the Wirral have got a very good Betula collection that's been collated by Hugh McAllister and Tim Baxter. And we've looked at I think there's about 10 or 12 different Betula pendula provenances and found significant differences in their turgor loss point, for example. And we would expect that, to be honest, most species with large geographical range would have different ecotypes, different provenances, different climate envelopes which they perform well in. And actually there's a real opportunity to go back to familiar species, but to exploit provenances that we may not have brought into cultivation. And I think, going forward, I know that Henrik and myself are certainly of the opinion that can be a real area for improving, our selections within horticulture.
Because in recommending a species, you might need to recommend that it comes from a particular...
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. But the problem is that at the moment, cultivars aren't associated with provenances, and frankly, we haven't got a clue where a lot of these things have come from. So, yeah, I think there's some fundamental digging in the archives, perhaps, but also some new science to be done on that. Of course, forestry is quite familiar with that type of work, but much less so in the urban realm, yeah.
That was a great talk, thank you. But of course you expect me to ask, how are you going to consider the impact of pests and diseases on recommendations for the future?
Well, so the question from Nicola was how do we consider pests and diseases in terms of our recommendations? Well, it has to be central. I've talked about abiotic stresses, but unless we select trees with our biotic threats in mind, really we do compromise the resilience of our urban forests really very seriously, because, I gave the one example there of the longhorn beetles that could take out an awful lot. Crikey, if we get emerald ash borer, that's going to remove it's going to make ash dieback look like a cold. And, xylella, let's not even go there. So we need to be really careful. And I think what will be good is if some of this sort of selection guidance can dovetail into the guidance like the plant risk register. And in fact, I point to that in the Teabag guide as being a point source. And the advantage of that is, of course, it's dynamic. It will be updated. And so I asked practitioners to engage with that, because any printed document or PDF that we release, say through Teabag, will only be accurate to that point in time. And we decided to shy away from those biotic threats because it is such a fast-moving, dynamic field. So we absolutely need to be aware of the work that's coming out of biosecurity efforts at a national level, because if we fail to engage with that, we are going to set ourselves up for huge problems. What I would say, though, is driving species diversity, making sure that we're not relying on very few species like we have done historically, is going to be really important.
Yeah, Andy, great talk, loved it. Turgor loss, looks like a really good predictor of drought tolerance, and sap flow, which is really good for water logging. But in a sense, they're still kind of symptoms, yeah? Are we any nearer getting at what you might call the really underlying physiological and anatomical variables that would enable us to actually just take a tree, and run it through a series of tests, say, this is what this tree will do?
How to summarise that question? Are we able to get to the sort of fundamental attributes of tree species? I think that's ultimately what those people that are interested in plant traits would aim to do. I've spoken about a couple. There's many others. So specific leaf area would be one. Wood density would be another that might yield useful information. A lot of the vulnerability of xylem to cavitation is based on anatomical attributes. Particularly the pit membranes. So, there's a certain amount we could do. And I think a lot of this is actually just applying some of the interdisciplinary work that's been done in ecology and putting it into our own context. So it's about learning from other fields and perhaps driving the data collection in a similar way that makes use of species that we're really interested in as amenity horticulturalists or arborists.
Yes, I wanted about a much simpler question of, in your research, have you found that British tree nurseries have been prepared to look at investing in greater diversity or sticking to the tried and tested favourites?
So have I found that British tree nurseries have been wanting to stick to their tried and tested favourites, or have they been driving diversity? Well, I think actually it's probably the community that specifies trees, which do a lot to limit the diversity out there. Actually, I've got about 280 species in that guidance because they were the species that were available in standard sizes and above, reasonably widely and securely, crucially, from UK nurseries. What we didn't want to do was start specifying the weird and wonderful and then incentivise imports directly from Europe or who knows where. That was really important, that we could recommend a palette of trees that we were fairly confident could be got. And actually, I think nurseries will be a lot, they will supply trees that there's a market for. And if we can, this is why I want to use traits to support the nurseries and what they going to, propagate in the future, because it can take the risk out of that. Otherwise, nurseries have hundreds of trees and nobody ever buys. They just want to go for tilia or maple or whatever. And, it's a financial risk to them. We need to say, okay, well, we want these species. We'd like you to produce them, but we will guarantee buying them. And work with our nurseries, make sure that where possible we can specify trees, 5 years in advance, so nurseries have time to respond to those sorts of demands. We've got to be much more strategic in our approaches from that point of view.
John Lane, I grew up in Lancashire, so I hope that helps.
Hey!
I know you've got a long way to go with your studies, and it's fascinating, but as of today, suppose I was a council member, what are your front runners? What should I plant? Have you got any indicators as of today?
What, in terms of species?
Names.
Names?
Name names.
Name names. I always try and avoid this question.
Ginkgo is not.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think it's always a danger recommending something that everybody plants, and then you're back to square one, aren't you? But I do think something like Ginkgo biloba is useful. Liquid amber is useful. Some of the cornus are quite useful. There's some prunus that are perhaps less floristically spectacular, but are more drought tolerant, and things like Prunus sargentii, for example. Even within the limes, most of them are really quite sensitive to drought, but Tilia tomentosa, Tilia mongolica, there we go. Tilia mongolica, had to dredge it up there. That again is a little bit more drought tolerant. So just by small adjustments, we can get a good range of trees in, and they won't be that unfamiliar to people. The other thing I would say is we have to work on our quality of our rooting environments so that at least some trees have a chance of surviving and performing well, because frankly, it doesn't matter what you do in terms of species selection. If your rooting environment is really poor or your plant quality is really poor, then your establishment is going to be compromised. So, it's not just about selection, not just about selecting drought-tolerant trees because they can put up with life. We need to be thinking bigger picture.
Guy.
We're a horticultural society, so manipulating plants is what we're all about. I wonder if there's much scope for increasing tree selection by more focus on maintenance and pollarding and coppicing and crown lifting, for example. Whether that would give us more options in street trees.
So the question is, can we use manipulation through pollarding and crown lifting and so on to increase our range of street trees? I would say, that may be the case, certainly for managing some trees, but I would caution away from entering into a situation where you plant trees that then need intensive management going forward, because actually a huge amount of carbon is used up in driving to the site, starting the chainsaws, energy, climbing it, all that sort of thing actually detracts from the services. So if we can plant a tree and then allow it to establish effectively and have a really low management input, then that's going to be much more sustainable going forward. So I would say in some landscapes, higher, more intense management is fine. And I absolutely would advocate management in order to maintain a large tree stock so that it can be useful for longer than it would otherwise be. But I'd shy away from trying to plant trees that need management intensively quite frequently, because I think that's a dangerous road to go down.
So, in your talks, which was very informative, you're focusing on specific trees one at a time. And if we are moving towards having greater diversity across the board and improving our rooting environments, do you see that we would be looking towards improving your recommendations not just on single trees, but trees that work well in combinations, that will go back to a more natural forest environment, but you won't get a monoculture? And likewise, which things actually work well together? Is that something you'd be looking into in the future?
Yeah, I think so. The question is, can we recommend, if you like, constellations of trees that work together effectively? And I think, the bottom line in so much of what we do in horticulture is if we can mimic natural environments, all well and good. That's not necessarily trees that grow side by side, but if we have, canopy species and understory species working together. I'm particularly interested in the way that, for example, nitrogen-fixing species can be used in planting beds to increase the nutritional value of a rooting environment that then supports other trees that don't fix nitrogen. And this is principles that are well established in forest gardening and other permaculture. And I think, there's absolutely no reason why we can't apply it more generally in our landscapes. So yes would be the quick answer.
You showed a lovely slide of trees of similar age but different size in a car park environment, but that made me wonder about how important the nursery conditions the young trees were grown in, what importance that has to the later growth and development of the tree. So nurseries often water quite heavily. Is that pre-training the tree to be intolerant of drought, or?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and in fact, some of my PhD was around, can we pre-stress trees to become a little bit more resilient? I think that is possible. One thing I would say in general is that plant quality is hugely important. And I talk about the momentum of establishment. It's a bit like a momentum of your career, if you like, or whatever. But if you have a good good root quality that is then able to acquire nutrient and water resources to expand a crown that then photosynthesizes more effectively, that then reinvests that into the biomass, then that whole momentum gets going. Whereas if you start off with a poor quality root that then doesn't really acquire the resources, it then struggles to expand a crown, and the whole thing's a bit of a downward spiral. So I think if we can make sure that we plant trees and plants, whatever, with the chance of building up this establishment momentum, then I think that's going to be really useful to do as well, yeah.
So it's a good case for home production rather than the stress of import.
Well, if you've got the skills for home production, sure, but sometimes production is best left to the professionals.
Have you thought of looking at, or is anyone looking at the impact of mycorrhiza on these factors and establishment and choice of species?
So is anybody looking at mycorrhizae on the in terms of using mycorrhizae for establishment of trees? Well, I think it's certainly very well established that mycorrhizae are overwhelmingly good for trees, and there's a symbiotic relationship between fungi and roots. The challenge is getting the right mycorrhizae with the right tree in the right sort of conditions, and that is very challenging from a kind of mycological point of view. But I think mycorrhizae have been demonstrated to be very useful at the establishment phase. But I think there's other things that we need to get right. So, in the absence of good soil aeration, for example, mycorrhizae probably aren't going to be that helpful. If we insist on putting fertilizers down and have high nitrogen fertilizers and then try and introduce mycorrhizae, they probably won't colonize the root system. So I would say if we can foster naturally occurring mycorrhizal associations, brilliant, but it may not always be the best thing to try and inoculate them commercially, unless there's very good reasons to do that.
James R. at
So how do we go about sifting through 15,000, was it? 15,000 trees and shrubs that, would be presumably useful to have all this information on. Well, we need to collaborate, we need to fund, we need to foster scientists, we need to build communities, not work in isolation. And slowly we'll get there.
And I was rather dismayed reading an article about an author really strongly recommending against planting ginkgo as a street tree due to its relatively low potential as an urban wildlife habitat, no forage potential for urban bird species. So I guess my question is, to what extent do you think that we need to prioritise biodiversity potential for urban tree species against their climate resilience and their aesthetic qualities?
Yeah, so to what extent do we want to limit biodiversity potential by planting climate resilient species? Well, that's a great question. It's a great question. I think the truth is we have to have an eye on multiple functionality. We have to, because there will be some species that are great at one particular attribute, and that may be appropriate to plant in some situations. But there's other cases where we might accept, a little bit less drought tolerance for, flowers that we know will attract insects. I mean, what I would say is that urban environments are fundamentally they're not native woodlands, and they shouldn't be treated as native-only spaces. And I think actually there's an awful lot we can do in terms of increasing the period of flowering, for example, with non-native species. So if you just plant native species, you're probably flowering, it's all concentrated around a few weeks. Whereas if you extend that palette, you can actually get flowering going right the way through into the summer, for example. And actually, some of those late flowering trees you can hear before you see them because they're just buzzing. So they're contributing a huge amount to insect life. So, I think, I would say we need to think about multiple functions, but certainly not shy away from things that may be a little bit more exotic, because I think they can also offer a great deal. And we're not talking about native woodlands outside of trees and towns. We're talking about amenity situations. If we only ate native food, crikey, we'd all be in trouble.
I think I'd add to that. It is about the diversity. So when we're creating landscapes, there's a general rule that the more diversity you have, the more resilience you have against the diseases, against ecological challenges, and therefore, if we can plant our landscapes, which is why it's dangerous and why you were reticent to say, give me the top 10 trees, because what you don't want to happen is a copy and a copy and a copy throughout. And this is critical of why we need to get our plant health regimes right, and a lot of good work has been done, but we also don't want to close the barriers down in relation to ensuring that we can have that genetic diversity still flowing in so that we have resilience to deal with a changing climate. As we understand more and more about this, there is very little information on biodiversity of trees. There's not a lot of research on that area. So again, I think it's part of the missing puzzle, but it's about planting multi-species forests, and gardens are really good for that because they're multifaceted at multi-layers. So yeah, right. Anyway. That's the end of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.